Hello, I am 8mm Mauser Man, and I have been collecting military surplus for a long time. However, it was only really in the last few years that I really got into firearms. As you can tell, I'm pretty young, so for a long time of just my interest in collecting and in military type things, I couldn't really purchase firearms, or at least not very frequently, just because of budget and things like that. So what I'd like to talk about today is things you can get into if you are interested in military surplus that aren't firearms, things you can collect that aren't firearms. The first thing that we should talk about is why. Why would somebody who is interested in military surplus choose to collect things other than firearms? And there are a few pretty good reasons for this. I mean, honestly, they might not be choosing to not collect firearms at all. So the first reason is budget. Firearms are expensive. Some of the cheapest military surplus firearms in original condition are around $200. However, usually you're going to be going into the $300 to $400 range on the low end. Whereas some of these other items that we're about to talk about can be had for quite a bit less than that. The second reason is location and laws. Some people in certain localities can't have firearms, or maybe they're limited to 1 or 2 firearms. We're going to talk about that as well. Maybe this is because of laws, or maybe this is because they are living in a small place and only really have room for a few things. Maybe if you are under 18, you want to collect military surplus things, but your parents don't want you to have firearms in the house. They might be okay with you collecting other things. And the third reason is just practical reasons. I already mentioned space. Maybe you live in a really small apartment and you just don't have room for a lot of stuff, but you want to get into some more collecting. Maybe you don't really want to own that many firearms. I have some friends who own firearms and like owning firearms, but they only own 2 or 3 and they're happy with that. Personally, I like military surplus firearm collecting, and since they hold value, I just kind of keep on picking them up whenever I can and they're available at a decent price. However, I do understand that not everyone is like that, so I wanted to make a video like this to reach out to those types of people. First of all, tell them that they are in fact normal, and secondly, you can still be interested in the military surplus hobby even if you can't own any firearms or you don't want to own any more firearms. So with that out of the way, let's just jump right into it. And the first thing that you can do if you want to collect military surplus, but you don't want to collect any more military surplus firearms, is collect around a gun that you might already own. Now, this is kind of a bad example because if you're in a place where you can't own any firearms or you can only own a few firearms, you likely won't be able to have something like this. But this is my M16A1, and it is one of the top pieces of my collection. So when I bought this rifle, one of the things that I wanted to do was I wanted to collect all of the different bits and caboodles that I could for this gun that were specific to it. So one example is I have this little optic on a gooseneck mount. These gooseneck mounts are military surplus. They've been used around the world in different places, and they're pretty cool. It's just a way of attaching a red dot or similar optic to a M16A1 or A2 that has a fixed carry handle. Another part that I wanted to collect was cleaning kits. So I'm going to open this up, and in the stock, I have the stock cleaning kit for this gun, and everything in here, well, most of the things in here are actually original to the M16A1 cleaning kits. If you're interested, maybe someday we can do a video on how to pack the cleaning kit into the stock. I also wanted a 20-round magazine for mine. This is an actual Colt 20-round magazine. It's probably not from when that rifle was originally serviced, but it is still pretty cool to have. Here is the original pouch for the cleaning kit, although the pouch that I have in there is actually an M16 pouch as well. Now, this actually has an old oil bottle that came with the cleaning kit, and it still has oil in it. Probably one of the coolest items I have for my M16A1 is the Preventative Maintenance Operation Manual that came out in the late 1960s. And this is actually a comic book, which is really cool. If you guys would like to see a video on this, leave a comment below and maybe I can show you that later. This is the Alice webbing for the M16A1 as well. So as you can tell, one of the things that I decided to do was collect items around my M16A1. Now, maybe you have a Kar 98K or something like that you inherited. Maybe it's the only gun you're allowed to own in your location, or it's really the only military surplus gun you desire to own. If that's the case, there's all sorts of items you can collect around each individual military surplus gun. For example, like with the Mauser Nagant, you can get the cleaning kit, the bolt disassembly tool, a bayonet, pouches, slings, cleaning rods, all sorts of other things that go with your Mosin Nagant if that's the only military surplus rifle that you desire or can own. Alright, secondly, maybe you could choose to collect items around a specific historical event. I've been really interested in the Vietnam War recently, so that was actually one of the reasons why I wanted to build an M16A1, but that's also why I wanted to get that whole Alice kit, is because I've just been interested in the Vietnam War, and because of that, I wanted to put together a kit that was similar to what they would have carried. Kind of going along with that, I also have this SKS chest rig. It's a Chinese chest rig, so there were likely a lot of people running around in Vietnam with things like this as well. Going off of that, a very easy thing to collect, and something that usually there is very little legislation around, is pouches, chest rigs, bandoliers, and the like. You can get all sorts of items relatively easily, and oftentimes they aren't that expensive. Like I said, this chest rig was I think $15 or $20, and it was possibly used in the Vietnam War. That Alice kit I just showed you, I put that whole thing together for around about or under $100. Probably the coolest thing I own that I've talked about a few times on the channel is this ammo belt from 1918. It's a US Army ammo belt, probably never made it to France, judging by its condition and the fact that it was made in 1918, so it just probably never made it there before the war ended. But it is still a really cool historical item that I am glad to own. I actually found this at a Goodwill and probably got it for $2 or $3. Turns out it's worth maybe $70. So pouches, bags, bandoliers, those types of things can be really cool. They usually don't cost that much money, and there's usually very little legislation around it. Also, they don't take up much space, so you can throw them all in a box and keep them as a part of your collection, or you could display them. One of the first military surplus items that I owned was this Romanian AK-47 bayonet. It's a really cool bayonet. It's one of the ones that has the wire cutters on it, which is pretty neat. Not that they're very effective, but it is still a cool item nonetheless. And bayonets are another item that usually there is not much legislation around, unless you live in Great Britain, but they can be very cool to own. So I have all sorts of different bayonets I'd like to show you. This one came with my Turkish Mauser, so it did come with a gun, but you could get it without the gun, of course. Just a really, I actually got it really cheap. It's in pretty rough condition, but it is still cool to own. This is a German Kar 98K bayonet. Let me see if the date's on this. Yeah, 1939, German Kar 98K bayonet, has some Waffenamps on it. It's really the only piece of German militaria that I own outside of ammunition. So it's just a really cool item that I think I got this one because the guy didn't know what it was. I think I got it for around 20 bucks, and that was actually a pretty good deal. It's rusted and it's not in great shape, but since I want to own it for the historical significance, not great shape is kind of okay. This is a bayonet for an Ishapur 2A1. I bought it because I owned one of these, and I really like it. It attaches to the end. It's just a neat piece of hardware. Again, not very expensive. This is an M7 bayonet from the Vietnam War for an M16A1. Yes, I do have the bayonet for that gun. Still another really cool piece. This one is actually in pretty good shape. There's not much rust on it. A friend gave it to me, and he did not have a sheath for it, so I bought just an aftermarket sheath. It's not original, but it does the job. It holds it and protects the blade. So bayonets are a really easy way to collect military surplus, plus there is a wide variety in what is available. Each old military gun usually has at least one bayonet. However, some of them have 2, 3, 4, or 5 different variants made for different purposes, made in different years, made in different factories. So there is a lot of stuff to collect. Also, a lot of them aren't that expensive. Even on the upper end, I'm not saying like very rare, but things like Kar 98K bayonets are usually around $100 if they're in rough shape. And so you can collect some really cool historical items without spending anywhere near as much money as if you are collecting firearms. While we're talking about not spending as much money, let's talk about cartridge collecting. Cartridge collecting is not something I really intended on getting into, but when I started collecting ammunition for the 8mm Mauser series, it was just kind of a natural side effect that each time I would usually have an extra box or at least a few extra rounds. And so I started just setting those aside and saving them for later. And then I realized I had actually a pretty decent cartridge collection built up. If you have a certain firearm, it's something pretty easy to do naturally. Or if you don't have that firearm, it's still a cheap way to collect pieces of history that is pretty simple. At least if you live in the United States, there shouldn't be too much restriction on ammunition collecting, at least not as much as firearms, and so it should be a pretty simple thing to do. I'll just pull out a few items to show you. This is Israeli ammo from the 1950s. I have a video reviewing this, and it's just 8mm Mauser. So everything in this box is 8mm Mauser. I have some East German rounds, which is pretty cool, from behind the Iron Curtain. I have German SMK ammo. I'm planning on actually doing my review of this ammo coming next week, so stay tuned for that. And then I just also have all sorts of miscellaneous rounds right here. We have a couple Chinese rounds, an Egyptian round, Winchester Super Speed, and a German head-stamped round. I think that's an SMK one. So yeah, ammunition collecting is a very easy way to get into the military surplus hobby, and it shouldn't cost you that much money. Even rounds that are fairly rare, like German ammo, usually you can still find it for a few dollars a round. So you can collect a wide variety of ammo and really not spend that much money. I bet if you were to go into most military surplus groups and said, I'm looking for one round of this manufactured ammo manufactured in this country, in this date, somebody would have something they might be willing to send you for only a few bucks. Cartridge collecting isn't necessarily something that I'm doing actively, but passively, as I get ammo, I'm usually trying to get at least one full box and one extra round for a display I want to make at some point. Let's talk about one more item, and this comes more on the legal side of things than necessarily the other practical reasons, and that would be things like Wallhangers, demilled guns, replicas, maybe like airsoft type stuff. And I don't actually have any demilled guns because why would I? I live in the United States. But this is just a non-functional firearm that I have. It's just a old H&R top break, and I keep it around because even though I wouldn't really trust firing it, it's a cool piece of American firearms history. It was, I think, $60, so if I tried to sell it, I wouldn't get much for it anyway. And the mechanism is just really, really interesting to me. So because the mechanism is interesting, I keep this around. So maybe even if you can't own firearms or you don't desire to own more firearms, you could find some things like this that might just be interesting to you, so you want to pick up. Oftentimes, if it's not in functional shape, it won't cost you that much money as well. I've talked about a lot of things from my collection and things that are interesting to me. However, there is a wide variety of other miscellaneous items that you could find that could be interesting to you. For example, I have a video on this first aid field dressing, and I just picked these up online. They were like $3. I'm sure if you wanted to collect just military first aid items, you could find a lot of stuff available that wouldn't really be that expensive like this was. A lot of it's expired, so it can't really be used anymore, and it's not something that there's really a huge collecting market for, so you can get them relatively inexpensively. I bought one that I opened up and one that I'm keeping sealed as a showpiece. Maybe for you it might be something like medical gear, or it could be military training equipment, military camping gear, military backpacks. Really any other type of military item could be the thing that you would be interested in collecting. Even if it's not the thing that I want to collect, it might still be something that is interesting to you, and so you desire to collect it. Oftentimes, things like this will cost you a lot less money because, one, there's usually less of a demand for things that are not firearms related, and two, there's usually a greater supply of some of those things. So like this military first aid item, I'm sure there are a ton of these in the market that you could find and that might be interesting to you. So with all of that being said, I am 8mm Mauser Man, and I showed you a wide collection of military surplus items that I own, but I lived on.
Which proves it's hard to get the best of a man named John.
Named John.